My legal career really started when I was a senior at KU as an undergraduate. It was at a time when virtually no women were even considering law school. But we had a dean of women here called Emily Taylor, who spoke to women long before anybody else did about the potential for women moving into whatever professions they thought they wanted to aspire to. So in the spring of my senior year, unknown to everyone that I knew and loved, I took the LSAT, the GRE, and the MedCat, and did by far the best on the LSAT. So again, unknown to anybody, I applied to law schools, and I got into law schools. So by then I had to get serious. But there were a lot of very funny stories along the way, but the story that really deserves a lot of credit is one of my predecessors on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, Jim Logan, was the dean of the law school at the time at KU. And I went to see him, and he encouraged me to go to law school, which now, in retrospect, I think was a sort of an act of courage. And I then, pretty much secretly, paid my deposit and decided to go to law school at the University of Michigan. My own father was very opposed to it. Really, till the day he died, he would say, "She's the lawyer." He was a highway contractor and really didn't like lawyers. And so he never really reconciled much, but I think in the end he was very proud of me. Well, I have to say my mother was a little more supportive, and there were four girls in my family, no boys. So I guess if they were going to encourage anybody, they had to encourage the girls. Mother had been very active in volunteer activities and so on. But I think it was easier. I think that she sort of said, I think they should do what they want to do. And so that made it easier. Also, I did well, so that made it a lot easier too. The first few weeks in law school were the most terrifying period of my life. I can still feel what it felt like to walk into a sea of men. Very different from my undergraduate experience at Kansas. A sea of men in these enormous classrooms, and you knew that they were there because their credentials were at least as good and probably better than mine. And you knew it was going to be a highly competitive atmosphere. It was also a socially difficult time. It was right during the time of the women's movement, the civil rights movement. There was a great deal of unrest all over higher education, indeed all over society. It was the height of the Vietnam War. I do not delude myself. I know why we got into law school. They needed to fill those seats because the men had gone off to Vietnam. Now, I think it would have happened within the next 5 years anyway, because the women's movement and the civil rights movement made such a difference. But my first year in law school was so challenging. And there were, I confess, times that I almost quit because it was so hard. And I'd been, frankly, a really good undergraduate, and I was just shocked how hard this was. But I had a very tightly knit group of women friends. We remained friends, just about 9 or 10 of us. We were each other's support system, largely. There were a lot of very sexist things that happened, things that today I can hardly repeat. And it wasn't individuals, it was just the way society worked at the time. And it's hard for me now to even kind of internalize that, but I can remember, for example, a criminal law class where it happened to me and it happened to many women, where when the rape cases were the day's assignment, the women were called on, they had to stand up, they had to graphically describe the facts in a room of perhaps 90 people with a smattering of women. That was degrading, it was humiliating, and it was just lonely. Now, those days are gone, thank heavens, they're gone for good. And in fact, now I can hardly tell the story because it seems so preposterous. I remember my professors in law school as being very smart and somewhat intimidating. At that time in particular, it still persists to some extent, but at that time, everything was taught in a very highly Socratic method. So you were called on and you were responding to questions, and you better be ready, and you could be humiliated at any moment if you weren't altogether ready. So I do remember that piece. However, I was so blessed at the University of Michigan to have some of the world's finest legal scholars. And I remember in particular Arthur Miller, who is still probably one, if not the best experts in civil procedure, was my teacher for civil procedure. And we actually staged a Superman entrance for him in this class, in a first-year class. When I think about having the chutzpah to do that, I'm astonished at myself. But we had so much fun. We're very close friends still to this day. I had Yale Kamazar for criminal law, who's another great, the one who encouraged me to apply for the White House Fellows Program was Tom Kuiper. At that time, there were very few women who even applied for clerkships. I didn't even know about clerkships at the time. But Professor Kuiper came to me and said, I think you'd be perfect for the White House Fellows Program. And he was right. And it made it a huge difference in my career. So I remember all of them. They were, in the end, very humane, very caring, but their first impressions were hardly that. I remember finishing quite well, and going, wow, I did that all by myself. And it gave me a sort of a confidence for the rest of my life. You know, if you can survive law school in 1971 to, 68 to 71, you can survive anything. So I remember that. I don't remember feeling unusual. I don't remember that. I felt like I was one of a few at the time, but I don't think I realized till years later how few it was. Because at that time, you just knew you were striking out in a new direction, but you didn't know the world would follow. And the world followed, and it was, it's so invigorating to see that. I had been a residence director in a giant freshman hall at the University of Michigan so I could get in-state tuition at Michigan. Well, I get to pick to be a finalist in the White House Fellows Competition, and I had to actually take an exam early, close out the freshman residence hall. My memory is several hundred freshman women, and fly to Washington overnight. My parents came and picked up my car and my stuff. I flew to Washington and went for this very rigorous weekend, which was the selection weekend for the White House Fellows. So I really love every law school graduation I've gone to since, because I never went to my own. So the White House Fellows Program is a program designed actually by John Gardner, who was in the cabinet when Lyndon Johnson was president. He decided that we needed to have a program that would take promising young people and put them at cabinet level in Washington. So every year, somewhere between 12 and 20 relatively new people in their careers are selected by a presidential commission. And then you're appointed to work with a cabinet officer for a year. I worked with the Secretary of Labor, who was then James Hodson. And at the time, I think I was the second Kansan ever selected, and the 8th woman is my memory in the program. Now, of course, since then, there have been many people go through it, but it was a life-changing experience to be a White House Fellow, because you were at the highest levels of government. You had an opportunity to meet literally the leadership of government, business, international countries. We took international trips. It was at the height of the Vietnam War, and I went to Vietnam at the time. It was truly life-changing, and I think forged my career from that point on.
Wow.
It was a very different environment, and if my husband were here to talk about, he would say that that return from Washington to Concordia, Kansas, was clearly the hardest year of our marriage and probably my life, because I was kind of at the pinnacle in Washington. He loved what he was doing. He was a high school basketball coach. It was a very small town with virtually no professional women. Well, there were no professional women. But that year in Concordia, I was essentially office sharing with another attorney. I actually got some great legal experience. There was a lawyer who was a wonderful model for me. By the way, the lawyer who agreed to let me come in with him was not the little law firm where the respected lawyer was. They would not hire me, the one that I had volunteered at. But there was also a local district judge named Marvin Brummett, who was so respected and trained me in ways in the courtroom that I could not have gotten anywhere else anytime. And he did it in respectful, collegial, thoughtful ways, sometimes when I did the dumbest things. So he was quite a role model for me. But I found it difficult to find friends. Now I ended up with some women friends that I just adored, and we really had a great time when I finally got acquainted with them. But they weren't women lawyers, and they hadn't had any real professional careers. So, so that was a very hard year.
So
I didn't want to become a judge. I resisted even being considered for a judge. I was very happy. I was a vice chancellor of academic affairs at Kansas. I love KU. I loved KU then. I thought, why would I ever leave here? But to sort of short circuit it, I knew that if I ever wanted to go on the bench, it was at that particular moment that I had to. I had just had my youngest child. I had a new baby. The thought of changing jobs and going to a whole different line of work was pretty intimidating, actually. I like to think I was a pretty decent university administrator and knew how to do that. And I didn't know how to be a judge at all. One of the things about being a judge is you just get appointed and you start. So I didn't aspire to it, and I actually resisted it. But, and there were, at the time, at least two, and perhaps many more, who were interested in the position on the circuit. And they were my senior, they were more experienced. I didn't feel like it was my turn, actually. And that wasn't humility, it was just thinking it wasn't quite right. The year, Kansans and Missourians will remember this year. The year that I was nominated was the year that the Kansas City Royals beat the St. Louis Cardinals in what was then called the I-70 World Series. Well, Ronald Reagan had the practice of always calling personally his nominees. But they gave you a day's warning. So my little boys were just maybe 8 and 6, I don't remember how old they were, but 8 and 6 roughly. So I came home that night and I said, guess what? The president's going to call me. And they looked up at me and said, well, that makes you about as good as Brett Saberhagen. Brett Saberhagen was the pitcher for the, for the Royals. So I told the president that when he called me the next day. He laughed so hard, and then a few days later the boys got a baseball signed by the president. So it was a really nice moment. Now, I can honestly say, and I have said in many speeches, that being a judge, I finally got to the place where I was an absolute equal with everybody on the court. My office was the same size, my pay was the same, I had the same vote as everybody else, and I can honestly say I never thought there was a moment at which my gender made any difference on the court. Your life experience as a judge does make a difference, and I can remember some criminal fact situations where there may have been, I don't remember precisely the facts, but may have been a domestic violence issue or an issue that is particularly difficult for women, that I often felt compelled to write the facts as carefully as I could to make sure they were appropriately explicated. But other than that, I honestly never felt the impact of any gender differences on the court. Certainly my years on the 10th Circuit were years of great responsibility, but also great reward in terms of working in the national realm on legal issues that were very challenging and very interesting with the best of colleagues. I think there is for all judges that moment of humility when you realize you are a part of a government that has been a beacon of liberty to the world and that it's partially your responsibility. So for me, there were moments like that. Sometimes they came in the middle of the night with a death penalty case, or sometimes they came when you were just laboring through a terribly hard opinion, that it was virtually an even call, and you were trying so hard to see what the right path was for the decision. There have been other administrative moments in my judicial career that have been quite high moments. I had the privilege of chairing a committee for the Judicial Conference of the United States twice. I think I may be the only person who ever chaired a committee twice that did a lot of our relationships with Congress, in particular on issues related to judges. And I remember one day having to preside over a meeting between the leadership in the Congress, a luncheon between the leadership in the Congress and the members of the Supreme Court, and I was the MC. And I remember standing up there and thanking everyone and talking about the legislation and talking about the interests of the court in the Supreme Court conference room and thinking, now wait a minute, you're from Scandia, Kansas, and you have the leadership of both houses, the Attorney General and the members of the Supreme Court in this room. That is really a sort of a show-stopping moment for me. And there have been several like that. I held a lot of really responsible leadership positions in the federal judiciary, and that was really quite an honor. One of the reasons I returned to legal education is I do have very strong views about what makes a good lawyer. I watched over the course of my career a lot of styles and a lot of lawyers. The best lawyers are people who view themselves as serving the common good and not just a client. Now, they have to serve their clients, but they also have to understand where the common good lies. Thus, I think a lawyer, as a professional, has a much larger responsibility than the day-by-day serving clients. Lawyers and judges are really the working models of the rule of law. Therefore, they have to model civil discourse. They have to show to the rest of society how we solve our problems in a civilized and humane manner. We do not take to the streets. The lawyer is the leader in making sure that this ship of state goes forward and doesn't crash on the shoals, if you will, of political rhetoric or self-interest or the cacophony of adversarial tones. So everyone who's ever heard me speak will hear me never say adversary. I always like to have them think in terms of advocates. And for a new lawyer, that's a terribly important model to follow, because some of the models in the media and even in courtrooms are shrill and awful examples of what I think a thoughtful lawyer who really can be trusted by a client, really can be trusted by a jury, and really can be trusted by a judge would be like.